Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 14. I'm Eric, the IT guy Hendricks, and joining me is my trusty co-host, Scott McBrien.
Good morning.
Today, we are going to talk about a topic that is frequently misunderstood, and that would be the security utility known as SELinux. The name is quite original. It's Security Enhanced Linux. So, Scott, you want to tell us uh, you want to walk us through a potential scenario that we might come across with SELinux?
Sure. And I think that this is reflective of a lot of people's first experience with SELinux, which is it breaks something that they weren't expecting it to break. And as a result, they simply turn it off, which is not the best mechanism for dealing with your problem. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a problem. All right. So, here in my home directory, I've got this index HTML file. Right. So, this is what I want my web server to display when we connect to it. And I'm just going to take this file and put it over in var www HTML. Helps if you tell it what to move there. All right. All right. So, it's over there with my other web content. And when I do a curl to connect to the local web server, I should see it, right? So when I do a curl, let me figure out my IP address real quick. So when I do a curl, 10 to 132.0.15, but that doesn't look like the content of my index, right? Here's my content of my index one more time. So I can see that when I do a curl, I'm getting not the thing I'm expecting. All right, and the culprit of this is actually SELinux. So we could turn it off, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to learn what's going on with it. All right, so the first thing we're going to take a look at is we're going to take a look at the error log for this, or the messages log for the system. All right, I don't see anything interesting there. Let me hit it one more time because I may have scrolled away. There we go. And so what I see here is this error. And so this is an error saying, "Hey, there's a problem." Wait, that's a different one. This one right here. There's a problem with this file, right? And that's why it's having the issue. And if we take a look at the bottom of the um, web server error log, right, it's giving us this error, right? That the permission to this file was denied, right? And that's SELinux blocking access to this file. But notice the error message that's being displayed by the Apache web server is permission denied. So that would maybe lead you to look at this.
Yeah, I was going to say there's because search permissions are missing, so that would lead me to think that maybe we need to adjust the file owner or maybe the permission sets. You know, maybe we didn't have a read flag set on a user or group that we needed.
Right. And when we look at the long listing of the directory here, like everything looks good. And in fact, if we really wanted to, I could do something silly like chmod 777, and it wouldn't fix my problem because my problem is actually not permissions. The problem is that a daemon, which is running under an SELinux enabled machine, has made a request for a file, and the kernel checks the SELinux policy to decide whether that daemon is or is not allowed to have that file. Right, so it's even beyond permissions. It's even before we look at the permissions of the file. We're checking to see whether the SELinux policy permits this action to occur, and it's not. So the kernel goes back to Apache and goes, "No, you can't have that." And Apache interprets that error or that refusal as permission is denied, which is why we're getting that feeling here in our logs, right? Because it was SELinux that was denying it, not actually permissions, but Apache can't differentiate between the two. All right, so the first critical command for SELinux that I'd like to introduce you to is instead of looking at this directory with an ls-l, we're going to look at it with an ls-lz, and that is a capitalized Z. All right, and when we look at this, what we get is an additional field of data known as the file context. And we can see that one of these files is not the same as the other files, right? And that's our problematic one, our index, right? This field is set to admin underscore home underscore t, whereas all of the other files in this directory are httpd underscore sys underscore content t. So what is happening is the Apache daemon makes a request for the file. The kernel checks the SELinux policy and goes, web server is trying to access admin home t contexted file. The policy rules say that that's not allowed. So no, you may not have that file, right? And that's what's going on. So here's the second important critical command for this scenario.
The restorecon command is short for restore context, and the context that Scott was referencing was the admin home t or the httpd syscontext.
All right, so now that I've run restorecon on my problematic file, all right, now its SELinux contexts look the same as all the other files. And if I rerun my curl command from earlier to fetch that page, I'm getting the correct file contents displayed to me, right? Because now that it's got the correct context, when the kernel looks at the SELinux policy, it goes, oh, Apache is trying to access httpd syscontent t type content. And that's allowed in the policy. So sure, here you go. And then the Apache web server gets the file and shares it out to the requesting curl connection. So that's kind of a redux of a people's first experience, I think.
Yeah, maybe in early RHEL 7 days, late RHEL 6 days, that may not have been the case. But certainly later on in RHEL 7 and definitely true with RHEL 8, SELinux contexts have gotten very, very good. They're very tight. They're very sharp. So admittedly, the ls-z and the restorecon command will fix like 80+% of the problems that you'll come across. So as I mentioned in the previous segment, SELinux got a bad rap when it first came out as just breaking all the things. So I kid you not, I've seen software vendors whose like second or third line in their documentation says go and disable SELinux. I don't know about you, Scott, but lately any package that I install from the official repositories, I don't have any SELinux issues these days. How about yourself?
I would hope not, because we included SELinux with RHEL. I think it was RHEL 3. It was either the RHEL 3 or RHEL 4. Like, it was way back. And as a newer technology, it took a while to get it kind of integrated into our workflow and processes and managing it. But really, from like Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5 and onward, it's been pretty solid. And all of the um, software that we ship with RHEL, especially in RHEL 7 and 8, complies with SELinux. And we've, as Red Hat, have taken the step of also working on this with our layered products too. So things that are based on RHEL or run on top of RHEL as other Red Hat products will typically also support SELinux, right? And the benefit of SELinux is that it stops programs from doing things that they maybe shouldn't. So on a non-SELinux system, if the web server tried to get access to a directory or followed a symbolic link outside of its document route to the home directory or to Etsy or somewhere else, it would be allowed to follow that and access those files based off the file permissions, right? So the web server runs as the Apache user, and as long as the Apache user had permission to read a file, it would have picked it up and sent it out. But with SELinux enabled, Apache is only allowed access to a certain type of files, and those files are stored in specific places. And I think that's the number one rule of SELinux, which is put things where we expect them. Because if you put them where we expect them, then they'll get the right contexts. And that's actually the root cause of why we had a problem this morning, right? Because what happened was this morning when I set up my problem, let me do a pwd real quick. I was operating here in the root home directory. And I created this file. And you can see that it got the admin home T type assigned to it. Right? And that makes sense because I'm creating this file in the admin home. But then I took this file and I moved it. And that's important because a move takes an existing file with all of its metadata like permissions, ownerships, SELinux contexts, and picks it up and puts it somewhere else. And so when I moved this file over to var www.html, it kept its admin home T type context in place. Right? Where, as if I go over to var www.html, and I create a file, hold on, LZ because it's a little easier to read. Notice that when I created the file in the correct directory, it got contexted with the right stuff, right? And that's what actually the restorecon did. The restorecon looked at where the file was residing and checked the SELinux policy to see what contexts normally go on files stored in this location, and then adjusted the incorrect context to match where it lives in the file system structure. Right. So if I took one of the Scott test and put it in root's home, I use my options well. When I pulled it into my home with a move, it dragged its original metadata with it. And if I do a restore con, right, it looks at where the file resides now and then sets the file context appropriately for where it's residing now. So that's how we fixed our problem, right? We just made sure it was contexted in a way that SELinux expected in the place where our daemons and processes are working with this file.
So, honest question here. If we were to say we're a web developer and we're writing HTML files in our home directory, is there an option within the move command to adopt the new destination's context, or should our users just get into the habit of moving files out of like their home directory to a destination directory and just have it be muscle memory to do a restore con immediately after?
So there's a couple ways you can approach it. I don't know of a move that resets the metadata, but we could look at the man page for a move and see if that's in there. Um, Generally, I would recommend instead of moving things, especially on an SELinux system, we copy things. Because copy will create a brand new file at its destination and then put all the same data inside the file. But because we created a new file at its new target destination, a new file gets new default contexts based off of where it's living. So that would be one thing. The other thing we could do is we can just restore con after we are positioning files around. RestoreCon has a capital R option, which will recursively restore the contexts, so that if there's a mismatch between a bunch of different files, you can pick them all up and recontext them at the same time. And that's actually something that I wanted to do in a second example today.
Yeah, let's go ahead and dive on in.
All right. So our second example, remember in a previous episode, we've created some users and they have a directory called data student. So here's the directory data student, and you can see that its SELinux context is root T. All right. And when we look at the content of student, oops, take off that D option. Um, that's the context of all the files in here. And what the students want to do is they want to share this directory using Apache. But currently, they can't do that because if we go in and we do all the Apache configuration of like setting the right document root and actually doing the server side config so that it serves files out of this directory structure, it will currently be refused to access these files because of SELinux, right? So what we need to do is we need to set a context on these files so that we can share them with Apache after we do all the server side configuration of Apache. Right? And we can do that a couple different ways. One is we can use a command called chcon.
And chcon stands for change context, but it's just fun to say. Let's be honest. Chcon.
So we could do this, and let's say data file 1. All right, so we can use chcon and we can individually adjust the context. Contexts have 3 fields: user, role, type, and actually there's 2 more. There's sensitivity and category. But the default policy we ship with RHEL is called the targeted policy, and it only looks at that type field. So you can set the other fields like user or role, but it won't matter if you're using the default context. If you've created a much more expansive context in your organization, maybe you'd use those fields. All right, and I see that in the chat, Taylor Vent has pointed out that move has -Z, which would set the context of your file at its location where it is moved to. So we could do that too instead of restore con. All right, so let me just do a restore con or a chcon on all these.
Chcon.
Chcon. All right, cool. All right, we're good to go. We've got our HTTP says content D. We're serving those pages out of Apache. Everybody's happy until they're not. Because while we chconned all those existing files, as soon as I put down a new file, it's got the wrong context. Oh, and by the way, currently, if we use restore con, man, yeah, um, because the context in this location is not set to automatically set the correct web server applicable type. Okay, so let's do a little bit more SELinux, shall we? What we're going to
So my
do.
guess is permissions are inherited from top level all the way down. So would it be safe to assume, Scott, that that if I change the context of the level above, that all the files within would then inherit that context?
No,
Oh
because the
no!
way that we set the context is based off of a policy of rules, and data student is not listed currently in that policy of rules. And that's why when we set or when we create new files, they're not getting the right context because where we're putting them has a specific, or who we're operating as will determine what default context they get. So what we want to do is we want to add a new setting in our file context to say, okay, when things go in data student, they should always be httpd syscontent. All right, so we're going to use a command called semanage. And semanage lets you make changes to your SELinux settings. We're going to change a file context. We're going to set a type of httpd syscontent t. And we're editing the rules in our policy, not the rules, but the file context settings in our SELinux metadata so that when files are put in a specific place, this is the default context they will get. So we need to tell it what that directory is. Okay. This is like really ugly, but it turns out if you look at the SE Manage man page, there's an example of doing this. Okay, so it takes a little bit because it's got to add it in there and convert it to binary. All right, so now if we do in a minute, I probably should have practiced this beforehand. Yeah. So when I do this f context-l, it's showing me all the file contexts that have been set at the different directories and stuff. So if I do a search for student, right, there's the one I just put in, right? That whenever files go into data student, they should get this default context assigned to them. All right, so now we're going to do our restore con. Okay, so actually, before I do that, right, refresh your memory. This is what our contexts currently are in this directory. Now I'm going to do my restore con. And thanks to my rule in the file context settings, files that go into this directory will automatically get HTTP syscontent T as their default type. And if I create a new file, data file 7, right, notice that it gets the right contexts. So this is another place where I see people struggle a lot because they'll do things like put stuff where we don't expect it. We don't expect web content to be in a directory called data student. Right? We expect web content to be in var www. And so because you created this additional document root outside of the var www directory, which is where we expected it to live, that's why SELinux is causing problems, because SELinux is like, whoa, that's not in web area. We shouldn't allow access to that. Which means that if you are trying to do this and actually like create a secondary document root with other rules and other people, you need to also be aware that you need to add a little bit of SELinux configuration to make sure that that non-standard location is recognized correctly.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that I see sysadmins struggle when it comes to SE Linux is you think because it's permission, it's a type of permission set on files and directories that it should work the same way that inheritance and all that kind of thing would work the same way as file permissions, but it really doesn't. But with with SE manage, restore con, and uh, yeah, I mean, SE manage, restore con, ls dash capital Z. I mean, with those few commands and just an understanding of if you're setting up a web server or a database server, understanding where those applications default to for their file storage, you'll avoid pretty much most of the issues. If you we'll get into a more advanced topic of SE Linux later on in the series, covering things like what if we're writing a custom app that we're going to write an application that runs out of opt my app or something along those lines, where you can actually write your own policies. But for the moment, if I suspected SE Linux as a problem, is there an easy way on my running system to kind of set SE Linux aside for a moment to troubleshoot, make sure that my web server is working correctly? Is there a way I can temporarily make that change?
Sure. And so this is a troubleshooting recommendation, right? It's not a permanent recommendation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's go back to our original stuff here over in var www. All right. So you recall when we started the episode that the index file had a type of admin t, and we experienced that when we did a curl, right, where it wasn't serving me the content of that I expected. So a really simple way to see if it's SELinux that's your problem or something else is to do a setenforce 0. That disables SELinux right now in the running state of the system because I didn't change any configuration files. If I had to reboot the system, it would come back on, right? But now that I've temporarily disabled SELinux and my curl command is successful, and then I turn it back on, and my curl command is not successful, whoops,
Hmm.
get the right IP. If SELinux is removed from the equation and it works, and SELinux is put back into the equation and it stops working the way you expect, that kind of directs where you want to look. And hopefully you now have some tools so that your resolution to this problem is not to just permanently disable SELinux, but instead to like look at what could be causing this and make adjustments on your system appropriately.
And one thing that I'll do if I am troubleshooting, say a network connection or a database issue where I suspect SELinux is the problem, I will use that setenforce 0. But I've been training myself to, when I'm done troubleshooting, to run kind of a sister command to setenforce, and that's get enforce, and that'll return a status code telling me whether SELinux is in enforcing mode, like we see here. So if we have the wrong context, like in our initial example, enforcing means that it'll actually take action. There's two other modes. There's disabled, which we don't want to do, and then there is what's called permissive mode. Permissive means that it won't, SELinux will not take any action, but it will continue to get logged. And we'll use permissive mode in our advanced SELinux episode later on. It's good to it's good to use permissive mode if you need to write a custom context, because you can go through and do those basic actions that you would use, whether that's accessing a file or following a symlink, because then you can take the log files and basically generate all the configuration you need for that custom application. But for today, I use get enforce and set enforce just to make sure that by the time I'm done troubleshooting, when my application is working as I suspect, then I can put it back in enforcing mode to make sure that security context is being addressed.
So, Eric, you mentioned making new policies. I think that's like 2+ episodes on SELinux away because there's still other topics that we need to cover. So, for example, I mentioned that the policy looks at the daemon that's making the request and the rules to determine whether it's allowed. So we have things like PS with a capital Z. So every process on the system also runs with a context, and that's how we know, oh, this is a web server daemon because it's running as HTTPD underscore T type. So we have to cover that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's Booleans, which are things baked into the policy where you can enable or disable specific features for daemons. So, for example, should the web server be able to access NFS file systems? That's controlled by a Boolean value. There's also SELinux controlling access to ports on the system. So when we change around something like our SSH port
Mm-hmm.
running on
I
a
was just
different
thinking
port
about
than
our
precise.
Yeah, I was just thinking about our episode from yesterday where we changed the SSH port.
Yeah. So like turns out there's port contexts too. So there's at least one more episode, maybe two, before we start talking about making policy changes.
So that's a quick look at SELinux and some of the more advanced topics that you can dive into on your own. Um, so I highly suggest re-watching this episode a couple of times because I've never seen. I will give credit where credit is due. Scott wrote the lab for this one, um, and I have not seen it presented in this simple of in this direct of a format before. I think if I'd had that example walked through for me before 5 or 6 years ago when I was starting with RHEL 5 and RHEL 6, I think I would have been in the stop disabling SELinux crowd much sooner. Um, we did have a story to share, but we're kind of at the bottom of the hour, so we'll save that for another day, or we'll release like a bonus episode about stop disabling SELinux. But For those of you joining us live, thank you so much for your questions. Tyler, thank you for letting us know about move-capital Z. I was suspecting that might have been the case, but I didn't have a terminal up and ready this morning. And join Scott tonight as he'll go through SELinux again. It'd be good to get that context again as well. Tomorrow we'll talk about man pages. We'll talk about some other things, some built-in tools that can help you along your command line journey. And last but not least, be sure to like, share, subscribe, tell a friend. This episode will be very helpful to anyone who's a sysadmin struggling with security requirements. But until then, we will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us.